that don't know me, my name is Dr. Lindsay Godwin, the Academic Director for the Cooper Writer Center, and it is my joy and delight to be here and welcoming Yabom Gilpin-Jackson as our thought catalyst here as we launch into our final day of the jam. As I was sharing with Yabom, it's just been this beautiful building dialogue and discovery and learning together, and that this topic about how can AI be impactful and informative and a tool in our world right now to face the challenges and the opportunities that we have as a global community in micro and macro ways. That this has been something we've been exploring, and I've been so delighted myself personally to get to know Yabom a little better over these past several months, and just in awe of the work that she is leading around the world. You all have been able to read her bio. She is the OD Network co-chair. She's an award-winning scientist and author, a leader in organization development around the world, and just an amazing human being. Yabom, I would like to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing, and just a profound bow and gratitude to you for being with us today, for bringing your voice and your wisdom into this conversation. And we are all eagerly looking forward to continuing our learning journey with you today. So thank you, Yabom.
Hello and good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Really appreciate being here, the invitation and the welcome, and excited to be in this conversation with all of you today. Such a joy watching everyone come in from around the world and having this opportunity to be in dialogue, in conversation, and in space with you as we together think about this moment in history and our work in the world. And so I am going to share my screen just to make sure that is going okay. Give me a second. And I see, Lindsay, that you can see it, so thank you. Welcome here. This conversation is about the power of resonance as we explore what's trauma got to do with it and think about how to facilitate in the context of the traumatic times that we're in, which also hold the possibility of resonance transformation. I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, the Kwantlen, and the Katsi people, among others, in an area that we currently, in colonial times, call Maple Ridge, outside of east of Vancouver, here on Turtle Island, and here in this area where as a nation, there is growing conversation to the need and commitment to continued truth and reconciliation and restoring of right relationships with our Indigenous peoples, but also as a Black woman of West African descent from Freetown, Sierra Leone, which was and continues to be at the nexus of colonial impacts. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is really important to me and personally meaningful to me and my family. And so this work for me, as it tends to be the case for many of us, is both personal, as it is my work in the world, as it is of social concern to all of us. And so I invite you, even as we go through this content, from wherever you are, to also be thinking about where you're located and what your rights and responsibilities are in the lands where you find yourself today. And I believe we were going to also post the link to nativeland.ca, which is a good tool for locating the lands that you're on especially around Turtle Island, if you don't already know that. So Lindsay and Jessica, I know that you've got that. I will not try to do that right now. And so we're going to work through these concepts of trauma and transformation, and then link them to appreciative inquiry and the resonance transformation possibility. We're going to have you in an experience working on your resonance story, and we'll talk about how that idea of resonance, that search for resonance, intersects with what many of us know, for those of you who've been long in the appreciative inquiry community and have been working with the 4D or 5D circle. And for those of you who may be new to this work, I will have that circle cycle on the screen, and we'll talk about where this idea of resonance, and specifically the context of working with appreciative inquiry in traumatic contexts, how do they fit together, and how do they fit in the appreciative inquiry cycle as we work with people and groups. So that really is our intention for the time we have together. But I'd just love to hear from a couple of you, and would love to have people put in chat and see what's in that waterfall. What brings you here in particular? Why is it important in the world that you are in this session? I know if you're here, it's because you're interested in learning and growing your practice and probably been part of this jam, but in particular, in this session about what's trauma got to do with it. Why is it important in the world that you are here at this time? Would love to hear and see possibilities in chat. So let's see them coming. And thank you around the world. Thank you, Sue, for posting as well, for Indigenous Australia. Let's see some comments in chat, and I'll actually also open the mic and see if any one or two folks would like to come on and share. All right, I see the waterfall starting to come as well. I'll read some of them out. If you would like to briefly come on mic as well, let's see you put up your hand. Jessica, if you can watch that for me. So some of what's coming in the chats: to show up with more empathy in the world, desire to connect with more understanding. I'm here because I am concerned about the vicarious trauma people have been experiencing throughout the pandemic and what is also happening at other levels globally. It's a bigger question than I realized. It's a huge one. And as we prepare to dive in, I'm going to ask that we sit in this conversation in the spirit of knowing that this is a brief wine tasting. It's a moment to just, as it's been framed in the jam, it's a moment for a thought catalyst. There's more to do, more to read. There's a resource on this work in the package that you have, and know that you are stepping in a way that means you will have to expect and accept some non-closure, and at the same time see what we can glean in the time that we have. Recognizing the complexity of traumatic aspects is the beginning of healing. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Grief and trauma work is my life calling. Anything in that space, I go perhaps in gratitude too. Thank you for being here. The sense that we're on the verge of collapse, and I think we need to understand more about AI in tough times. Thank you. Thank you for those. Keep them coming, and I'll invite people to keep looking at them. I love how, as we know the wisdom is in the room, your comments really summarize the essence of why this is important. And it's everything to do with the healing that is necessary in order to do transformative work in traumatic times. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. Thank you. Lots of great work here. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. And so I will get us going. There'll be more opportunity and you'll have an opportunity to talk about this in circle with each other. The central question we are working through is, how do I do appreciative inquiry in traumatic circumstances? What are traumatic circumstances? Specifically, when we talk about trauma going forward in this space, I am referring specifically to events of seismic proportions that significantly challenge our assumptions of life. By seismic proportions, I'm referring to anything of earthquake type impact. I'm talking of trauma specifically as something, as we will say in colloquial terms, that rocks our world, that has us bring into question our assumptions about life, whether that is social life, organizational life, family life. It is the psychological phenomenon that because of an event or a series of events, we experience intense emotional and psychological impact. It is collision, it is impact in our interior experience that rocks our world. And this happens at all levels of system. Specifically, this is not a strain. A strain is more associated with everyday stresses, recognizing that accumulated everyday stresses can eventually become traumatic. But I'm talking up here about things that invalidate our assumptions about life, about living, that shake our fundamental social contracts of safety, and whether that's physical or psychological, that bring into question everything that we've known. And I used to spend a lot of time here before the pandemic. This is work I've been doing well over 10 years. And in recent times, it's been as simple as saying, just think about everything that happened in your interior experience when the reality of the pandemic set in for you. Everything that happened in your experience when you realized that the way we live and the way we work and the way we socially interact had fundamentally been invalidated. Our assumptions of doing those three things, live, work, and interact socially, were all brought into question and changed as a result of the pandemic. That is a traumatic impact. And so what does it look like and how does it show up? I'm using organizational trauma here to mean any way that humans organize. So not talking about formal organization, but any ways that humans organize. The reality about organizational trauma, where people organize, is that it is often unacknowledged. However, because humans are humans are humans, people are people are people, wherever we gather, there is possibility for the full spectrum of human experience. And therefore, trauma can be inherent in organizational life. However, it's an unconscious element of group life. When I started doing this work and research, I was astonished by how little there was in terms of research on organizational trauma. But that in itself speaks to the nature of trauma. We don't want to talk about it. It is easy for us to suppress it because it is hard. And because it means we must confront truths when we uncover the reality of trauma in our experience. Trauma can happen by an event or an accumulation of events. I've already spoken to it having seismic impact. It challenges the fundamental core of our beliefs, and it reduces our emotional and overall psychological functioning. We know there is trauma when there is persistent, in our experience, persistent symptoms. These symptoms are often an indication to something more under the surface. And there's a long list here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But specifically, we know that there is the possibility of trauma when in our organizational context, we find that we're spending the most time leaning towards those aspects of our human experience that, that move us towards negative affect. Those aspects of our human experience where we feel helpless. And so what I'm really going to point here overall here is that when we have an accumulation of symptoms where we feel stuck, it is possible that we're in a context where there is traumatic experience, where there's a sense of helplessness, and people are not sure and don't understand what is needed in order to move forward. And so as you interact in that context, you hear over and over these symptoms. And what I want to point to here is fundamentally the overall experience of stuckness, of helplessness, and the numbing of emotion. So you'll hear people start talk about their experience and then move away from it. Talk about the experience and move away from it. And I'm sure we've all been here. So what is the impact? And notice your own experience, even as you hear me talk about this and put up a chat like this in a space where we're talking about appreciative inquiry. Just pay attention to your own experience in this moment as well. The impact and the reality of this is that we are in this gray zone. Again, something that I've been talking about for some time. This gray zone, this space between systems. The impact of trauma is that as we call into question our assumptions about life, it opens up this space, this in-between space where, again, if you think about your experience in the pandemic, once the reality of that setting, for me, there was this sense of life as I knew it has changed. And yet, simultaneously, there was this sense of, and life as we want it to be, as it ought to be, is completely undefined and unknowable. We are in this chasm, in this middle space that is transitional space. And yes, that space is characterized by the reality of trauma and traumatic impacts, but it is also a space of transformative possibility, which is where our work and our engagement with this in this space, in our use of appreciative inquiry comes in. Because in that space is the possibility to face and confront trauma and to look at transforming it into possibilities that move us forward, that move us out of being stuck, and where there is a possibility to take giant leaps forward. Because life as we know it begins to disintegrate, and because this gray zone is a space where there are lots of questions, there are no clear answers, there are new things to consider regularly, the end goals and solutions are unknown, and process and progress is emergent, depends on what we're learning, depends on what is emerging in our collective, in our construction of the future, because many people are involved and everything seems chaotic. In this space, we require transformation. Transformation specifically meaning here, new ways of doing, of being, and of thinking together. And transformation is needed because if the world as we've known it is changing and transitioning and being called into question, then our form of organizing needs to change. We need to find new ways of doing, of being, of engaging a world that's called into question all of the ways we organize, a world that is calling for new ways of living and engaging in social context, in our social contract around what we're calling justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, that wasn't new, was here, was called into sharper focus as well through the pandemic and ongoing. Um, the realization for many, not for many that were doing the work, but for many globally that are engaging now with this work, is that life as we know it needs to change. But what does it have to be? We need to find new ways. Sometimes it's not enough to try and change existing systems. We have to create new ones. And we have to look at the mountain and leave it there and generate new possibilities and create new roads and highways and pathways and flyways to take us to the other side. And so transformation is required. So what about this? It's emotional space, knowing both about the reality of trauma and the possibility of transformation is complex. We're faced not just with the context of complexity, but complexity at the edge of chaos, which means there are only two ways forward: an emergent way where we figure out what needs to happen, and a novel way where we experiment with new ways as we seek to transform the world. And it can be heavy and it can be emotional. And as practitioners that want to step into this space and practice appreciative inquiry and bring that focus on the positive core, this poses a challenge. Because how do you, for example, step into a space where, let's say, as we look at the state of the world currently, as we look at wars and conflicts around the world, many of us watching Ukraine, but also knowing that there is the ongoing impacts in Afghanistan, in Syria, the impacts of war that's been happening in Ethiopia and the Tigray, and around the world, Myanmar, as we look at war and armed conflict and humanitarian crises, both known and unknown, both supported and unsupported. How do you walk into a group of people, for example, working in that context? Working with the real human impacts of people there, and go straight into asking about the positive core without addressing the reality of their experiences. What I want to say to you is working on the positive core in a context of trauma starts with a full acknowledgement of the context of complexity, of harm, and of difficulty that people are faced with. And it is often in the exploration of that, in the uncovering of that, in almost the relief of being able to surface that trauma, that the positive core begins to emerge. And you'll see how that is in a moment. I love our proverbs to anchor our thinking, and I love this one, not attributed, but generally placed somewhere in Northern Africa. No matter how hard it may get, a way out or eventual comfort will be provided. After hardship comes relief. And this is often hard to see in the midst, but it is the possibility that we can start calling to in traumatic context. So this is a big chart, and the slides will be provided after, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. But what I want to point to here is three things. Is that where there is trauma, which is the experience here, which is a normal and very natural human experience, when our normative way of functioning has been called into question, there are three possibilities. There is the reality of traumatic impact, which lowers our level of functioning. There is the resilient possibility, which many of us tend to gravitate towards and talk about. What I like to remind people is that resilience, the classical definition of resilience, is a bounce back. It is a bounce back to normative functioning. Resilience is necessary, but not sufficient for growth and transformation. Resilience gets us back to baseline in its classical definition. And when there has been trauma, there is a third possibility. It is moving from trauma to resilience to transformation, and sometimes leapfrogging, taking the giant's leap straight through to transformation, which encompasses resilience. Transformation is a higher level functioning. It is ending at a higher level of psychological and emotional functioning, where we're better able to not only cope and survive, but to look at the possibility of thriving even in the midst of chaos and complexity and trauma. So 3 possibilities: trauma, resilience, and transformation. In the midst of traumatic context, and where my work started was actually working with groups of people that had been impacted by war trauma, either vicariously or directly. And in those communities, noticing transformational leaders and transformational work occurring that was going unrecognized. So very much in our world of appreciative inquiry, a focus on where things were already working at a positive core in the midst of very bleak circumstances. And in those communities, having people recognize and point to the transformational leaders that were making that work possible in their midst. In interviewing those transformational leaders, what surfaced was the pattern that for every one of those people, they had a story from their lives that I began to label a resonance story. It was that these people had a resonance story, that they were able to support community to surface their own resonance stories, and that because of that, these communities were able to process their traumatic impacts, begin to work towards healing, and in that process, move towards transformation individually and collectively. So resonance is a moment of awakening through personal story that opens space and creates possibility for transformative learning and ultimately transformation. Resonance in itself is not transformation. It opens the doorway towards transformative thinking, being, and working together towards transformative outcomes. And so resonance transformation, it becomes possible because of the surfacing of a resonant core. So this is a quote from an article that you will have in the Giants Leap special issue from the Organization Development Review, which I had the honor of being part of and writing the article, What's Trauma Got to Do with It in. We need to transform a world that has become calcified into creating negative impacts for the majority of the world. We must therefore be willing not only to critically examine and deconstruct, but also to create new forms to take us into a positive future by surfacing deep developmental shifts from moments of awakening, and that is resonance. Surfacing deep developmental shifts from moments of awakening. And so, of course, we're faced with this question of how to achieve that within the context of trauma. As practitioners that are interested in this is my proposition to you, is in order to facilitate for transformation and use what we know well of appreciative inquiry, we have to start by understanding the trauma narratives that exist in our context. We have to transition by supporting people to connect to resonance. And then and only then can we move to uncovering possibility as we're used to in appreciative inquiry context to ignite the transformations that are possible. This, of course, needs to be done in trusted disclosure, in a way that encourages meaning making, not the automatic meaning making that we're stuck in when we're in trauma, but the deliberate meaning making that provokes new insights and leads us towards transformation. And that's what happens when you surface resonance, allowing people to share their stories, but not in a way that causes them to continue to be stuck. The other extreme of sharing traumatic stories, which I think many of us have also maybe experienced, is this continual recycling of traumatic narratives with no doorway into where that is taking us. And that is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the intentional systemic work of uncovering and understanding trauma narratives with the purpose of completing the cycle, taking it to resonance, and then taking it to the uncovering of possibilities and igniting transformation as a result. So what does that look like in the context of appreciative inquiry? So appreciative inquiry, as many of you know, and for those of you that may be new to this work, operates through this cycle of supporting our systems, of organizing our human systems to define and disclose the question, the inquiry that that community would like to work on together, in the search for a positive core that will lead them to possibilities related to that question. When you are in traumatic context, that definition work also involves the disclosing of traumatic context, disclosing the reality of traumatic context that affects the question, the appreciative question that you want to work on together. Often in traumatic contexts, what I have seen is that the disclosure of trauma gets bypassed. However, as the work moves into discovering where the community is already, what is already working in that community, discovering the possibilities in order to move to dreaming about a new future. Often I have found in traumatic context and where my work has come in is that people get stuck because the disclosure of trauma has not been done. And because the processing that allows for resonance to be uncovered and therefore healing to start, and therefore our neural pathways to be opened up so that even and despite of being in traumatic context, we can move to thinking about possibility and dream together can be opened. And so when working in traumatic context and practicing the AI cycle, disclosure must happen right at the onset where the definition of the inquiry question is formed. And then that must be moved forward into the discovery and into the dream, which of course then leads us to design, the collective designing, co-designing of shared futures, and then the destiny and delivery of that. So specifically, the work in trauma context starts right at definition and then moves through the cycle. And therefore, the search for resonance it starts right there at the search for the positive core that we want to amplify, that we want to spread in the systems that we're working in. So I'm going to introduce you to a micro practice that can be scaled to a macro practice for doing this in traumatic context. And that is this idea of resonance stories. A resonance story is a personal account. It is a story from your own life that deeply connects you to identity and purpose. It is a story that anchors you in your identity and purpose, regardless of the traumatic context around you. A resonance story can be verbal, it can be written, it can be symbolic, it can be metaphoric and expressive, but what I have found is that it is anchored in personal narrative and story. And so for the purpose of this invitation, I'm inviting you to surface for yourself, what is a story that comes to mind that deeply connects you to your identity and purpose as a human being in the world in these times? The characteristic of resonance stories that surfaces from people that are transforming trauma into possibility are these. Again, it comes from your own life. It's a remembrance from recent or could be as far back as childhood or recent past. It deeply connects you to who you are in the world, so identity and purpose. It is a trigger with a quality of nostalgia, and so it is emotional. It is something that really anchors you to the reality of who you are. It emerges from the continuum of our human experience. So appreciative inquiry is the search for the positive core. It doesn't negate that positive core can and often does come out of negative circumstances. It often comes, like for my interviewees, from experiences of adversity where I heard people say things like, because I grew up in such dire circumstances, I am standing for creating a world where no child has to grow up in those circumstances in the future. And so it emerges from the continuum of our positive emotions and our negative emotions. And because of that, it provokes insight and the deliberate exploration of possibility. not the stuck regurgitation of the trauma, but the deliberate moving through to possibility. One participant who I included in my original study through written account, Marietta Kamara, who wrote the book, The Bite of the Mango, wrote this at the point in her narrative that shifts from a trauma narrative to a transformative narrative. Something in me had changed. I knew now that I could look forward and back without any regrets at the same time. And that is the classic characterization of moving from trauma into the space of resonance and transformation. So what is that for you? I'm going to invite you to just journal, if you have a writing implement, to surface for yourself responses to this. Responses to this idea, to what is a story from your life with a quality of nostalgia that deeply connects you and signifies your organizational and life purpose. But to do that, by first thinking about what is the traumatic context that you are working to transform. So I'm actually going to stop sharing screen and I'll put this prompt in the chat. What is the situation you want to transform in a traumatic context? And what is a story from your life that deeply connects you to your personal and or organizational purpose in that context? So what is a situation you are working to transform? And what is a story for you that deeply connects you, a resonant story to that situation? Please journal, jot down, and if you are visual, draw something if that's what's coming to you that really signifies that for you. Please do not censor yourself in this moment. See what emerges. See what is being surfaced for you. Give it another couple of seconds here. And momentarily, we're going to invite you to a sharing circle. About 10 more seconds to see what is emerging for you as a story from your life that deeply connects you to your personal or organizational purpose in the context of a traumatic circumstance that you're working to transform. And we're going to invite you into a circle. You'll have 15 minutes in that circle. Jessica, does that still work for you? 15 minutes in that circle to do a couple of things, and just allow me to set that up for you in here. In that circle, please say hello. Say hello to each other, and you'll be in a triad. And here's what we'll ask you to do. In 15 minutes, take 4 minutes each. So one person, please, please track time for each other. So one person will be a timer, and then one person will go first in sharing their story. But here's what I would like you to do. Story sharer, please share the essence of your story. Again, this is a wine tasting, and although our stories are deep and wide, you have an opportunity to take a minute or two to share the essence of your story. It sounds like, hello, my name is Yabom. I am a West African woman from Sierra Leone who grew up in the context of having post-colonial parents who really were hopeful for the future of their country, Sierra Leone. In doing that, they studied abroad and they went home to do that work and found themselves at the nexus of traumatic impacts that accumulated and culminated in war. In that war trauma and in that experience, I left and became committed because of what I had experienced and because of the impacts I had seen on people, to looking for two things: the possibility of transforming war experiences for people into the transformation possibilities of working with groups that had suffered those impacts to return to their communities and make a difference, as well as in macro sense, working for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, including what happens for people, Black people globally in the world. And for me, that story is anchored in my children and the reality that in leaving Freetown and Sierra Leone, in journeying to Canada, I realized that my children are subjected to the same traumatic impacts that I experienced in my West African nation. And that is of being questioned about their Blackness, of being told that they are different, of being told that no one wants to play with them because they are Black. And it is anchored in the stories that they come home with, describing to me the experiences they had had when they're questioned at schools, that collided with my own experiences in global context of war and the realization that being Black in the world, whether on or off the continent, requires working for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. That was a resonant story in 2 minutes, anchored in the story of my life and the life of my children. So share like that, and then others, having heard that, do this. Ask these questions, and storyteller, please share brief responses. So these are rapid fire questions. You'll notice in my story, I shared some answers to that deliberately to give you a taste. What is your resonant story calling you to? What renewed purpose does the resonant story evoke for you? How does it shift your consciousness to others and the context of the world? And what deeper development does it require of you? Now, you perhaps will not answer all the questions. People who have been listening, when you've heard the context of the story, choose one or two of these. You don't have to ask all of them. Ask the story sharer, answer them. Your sharer might have already spoken to some of these, so choose the one they may not have spoken to and have them respond to it. At the end of it, please say thank you and then pass on the baton to the next person. I want to remind you of this as you listen, the reminder that you're listening in sacred and brave space. Please, speaker, share what you want to, extend trust and vulnerability, allow insights to emerge, and be willing to be witnessed. Listeners, please suspend judgment. Listen to learn, not to fix, not to caretake. Recognize that it is the speaker's story and not your own. And be open to the surprise of what is here for you, what you learn from their story, even in this brief moment. And be ready to witness another human being share their story. So sharing and listening for 4 minutes each and a couple minutes just to decompress, and then we'll be back in the circle. Welcome back. Thank you. Welcome back. Appreciate it's hard to disentangle from these conversations so quickly. Appreciate that this is work I would typically do over a half day or a full day, over several days. And again, there's some non-closure here, but I hope enough for you to have captured the essence of the experience of surfacing and processing through resonance stories in traumatic context. So we were wondering and wanted to hear in this space, not the stories, want to honor the space and the stories that you got to share, but what insights emerged for you from sharing your resonance story and answering the trauma-informed appreciative inquiry questions. Because I didn't say that, but there's a question set that's in the special issue that are, the trauma-informed questions and ways of doing AI. Love seeing the hands. I see you, Julie and Nina. I hope I said that right, but I'll start with Julie. So your hand first, go ahead.
I think for my partner and I, and like I'm like blanking, I'm so befuddled in another world now. I'm like my partner's name was France, France. That we were both struck by, as you talked about, that we need, the trauma is there, and that we were both in tears as we told our story. And mine was 30 years ago and hers was 9 years ago, but how very present and vivid it was.
Thank you. And thank you for doing that work. I'll say more about that momentarily. Thank you so much. Nina, go ahead. Is it Nina?
This is Nina, spelled differently. So first of all, please help me pronounce your name right. It's Yabom.
Thank you. I usually say that at the beginning and forgot today. It's Yabom, like home. Yabom.
Yabom.
Yes, the E is silent. Yeah.
And if you were to just listen to the rhythm of it carefully, Yabom, like home, and like home, that's the feeling that you gave me. First of all, I want to really applaud your courage to take this work to the organizational space, because that's what I have been trying for several years now. And I know how much resistance, how much of indifference, how much of bullying this work away is there in that space. So I really applaud your courage. And all of that you were saying on your different slides, was taking me back to different pages on my book, which holds exactly the similar principles, that resilience is not an, bounce back is not a complete expression of resilience. Resilience is not a fully sufficient condition, that there is a resonant turn point, and that transformation is a deeper and higher journey. So the simultaneity of trauma and transformation that you talk about, and I also talk about that simultaneity of grief and growth, is, what struck me was when you asked people to first write down. Because writing trauma and grief has so much more value before we begin to talk about it. When we are talking to ourselves in the privacy of our journals, the value that it has is so much more pure, so much more sacred. So thank you so much. I mean, I of course, there's so much content of what happened in our breakout room that's not required here. But I really want to thank you and express my gratitude for taking this work to the organizational space. Consider me your soldier if you ever need one.
Yay. I'll find you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And wonderful insight there around writing before speaking. That was intentional. This is research-based and evidence-informed, the practices, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. One more voice. Would love to hear one more person speak to an insight that emerged from sharing your resonance story. I'd love to hear 3 voices, so one more. Come on. Far. Oh, and I got two. Okay, so Far and France. And oh, yeah, go ahead. And then we'll end here.
Okay, so was great for me to notice that the three persons we share this space at the end find a way to bring meaning to what we identify like a trauma in our histories. You know, the three of us actually are doing right now something connecting with that. You know, we recognize that. You know, we do programs connected with that. We work in fields like education or more happiness to connected with that. You know, in some ways, one insight for me was that coming from a trauma story, I connect with this idea that or believe that there are no time to lost and a life to enjoy the most you can. Okay, it's curious because it's coming from my trauma, you know. Maybe part of my purpose, and I can realize right now, is how to facilitate for more people to be aware of that and enjoy the life the most you can, because there are no time to lose.
Brilliant. Thank you. What a great appreciative framing as well. Thank you so much. France.
Thank you, Yvonne, for this work. It's important work and always interesting. What emerged for me as I was listening and sharing is how much we've already processed of some of this. You know, as Julie was saying, hers was 30 years old, mine's 9 years old. Yet there's still so much locked away and so much more that can emerge, and how having a witness when you're expressing it really does bring out and let emerge some of those important things that are locked away.
Great insight. Thank you so much. Robin, I saw your hand. I'll just quickly take you and then we'll move to, you're on mute.
Sorry, that took up valuable time. I'm sorry. So thank you for that. I think, you know, in addition to the value of writing and journaling about this, the two other aspects that we brought into our conversation was that voice is so important to be able to express, and that your voice is something that kind of carries that through, as well as how we embody and we carry trauma in the body. And so giving expression to appreciation of body and voice, it's, you know, that's more than the intellectual understanding or the cognition of the pain, trauma we've experienced.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much. So here's some summative comments, and then I think there's a bit of space for questions. Thank you so much for seeing those insights, and so much there. Everything that everyone said connected to what happens with resonance practice and why it's important. Here is what unfolds from resonance. And once when I do this work, so I'm just going to quickly go backwards to, sorry, okay, I'll have to find that slide for you here, right here. When I do this work, I mentioned surfacing resonance stories is both a micro and a macro practice. And I'll show you how I've done it in organization and systems in a moment. In the discovery phase and the initial work, I spend a lot of time and don't shy away from the uncovering of trauma. I love the comment about, even though we think we've done it, there's so much yet to unpack. I can tell you story after story, going to work with human service professionals or nonprofit groups that work with different people groups in different traumatic circumstances. And, they just want this as professional development. And inevitably, we stop the process and we focus on their own resonant stories first, because inevitably they realize that they're doing the work they do out of their individual identity and purpose that is anchored to their own lives, and that they gain insights for the work they need to do with the groups they're working with by going deeper in what has been unprocessed. So we spend time on uncovering trauma. We in physical space, we'll have a wall where we say, what is the current context? And people will put things up, and we actually name the trauma narrative. So I use this example because for some reason it's one that stuck with me. I worked with a group that called the trauma wall the scream. And then we worked on resonance narratives and surfacing resonance. And through that, began to work through the appreciative inquiry circle, moving towards what they wanted to create now, and etc. And why that works once you've hit resonance in terms of moving to the latter stages of appreciative inquiry and uncovering possibilities and igniting the transformation narrative is because naturally, and from the research, once you uncover resonance with true trusted disclosure and meaning making and insight, where organizational groups that have not been able to voice the reality of their experience suddenly have an opportunity to do that, it opens up that space. Remember, it's the moment of awakening that opens that space for transformation. And what unfolds is these 5 themes is people are able to deepen or reaffirm or sometimes name a new purpose. Their connection to each other, using human connectedness broadly here, but it could be, so for example, did a lot of this work in healthcare groups, right? Where we'd go and say, what is the trauma and what is the vicarious trauma? What is the context? And, name that narrative. And then we say, okay, well, what is the story from your life that deeply connects you to healthcare and why you chose this profession in the first place? And beautiful stories emerge along the whole continuum of experience. People share those stories. We deeply harvest the insights that emerge from that. And then we say, okay, with that context in mind, what is the future that we are creating here? What do you want to create? More of the same in the stuckness or something new? What's the transformative possibility? Because inevitably in harvesting the resonant stories, people will name how they feel connected to the groups they serve. So human connectedness in that sense. Resonance also sparks a deeper sense of development, spiritual, moral, psychological development. And noticed how people's language, as we know, language matters in appreciative inquiry. And I noticed people's language begins to shift. And that's how I know we've hit resonance. When the language shifts from trauma-centered language to life-giving language, to that appreciative core, it happens naturally when you move through this process from trauma to resonance into possibility. And it happens very naturally. Because they're at a different level, they've begun to bounce forward instead of bounce back. So I use bounce forward to talk about transformation. And then the valuing of life, whether it's a community group and it's their social life or work life, people start to see why things matter. You start to hear more in the transformative narrative, why this matters, why we can't give up. And that leads to a lot of energy for action. So what I find is we move into this space. And of course, as we do the destiny and the design work, you hit those hard points where people start cycling back. But it becomes simpler, not easy, but simpler to say, hey, I'm noticing we're saying this or that again. Have we moved back to the screen? And what resonance do we need to call on? What is our resonance calling us on to stay and move forward in designing and creating this new vision of the future? And by the way, we also name the new narrative. So once we move through resonance, as we begin to look at destiny and design, we say, what is the narrative we want? And people will have a trauma wall and we'll have the new narrative wall, and people will name the new narrative. They'll give it a name. So, let's just say the resonance narrative. How do we stay with the resonance narrative? And it becomes an easy way to get unstuck, or an easier way to get unstuck. I said it's a micro and a macro practice because here's how I've done this work in a macro sense. Worked with a system or with systems, I mentioned like healthcare groups, moving them from initiating the transformations. So the AI work, that initial definition work happens here as we define purpose, as we negotiate, okay, what is the question? What is the appreciative question that we're here to accomplish moving forward together on, and etc. Then we surface the resonance narratives. That's all in sort of that initial definition and destiny work. And then we start moving into design, and we still we continually connect to resonance as we work through. For simplicity, I think of my phases when I'm working as a facilitator or consultant in these three, but you can see how the 5D cycle is very much in and through this, where we move through that whole process as we initiate, as we facilitate the journey, and then as we sustain it. So leaving you with this, this was a wine tasting in my book, Transformation After Trauma, which really the article pulls from and sort of left off from to specifically apply to appreciative inquiry. There are a lot of practices for facilitating for transformation and facilitating for resonance in that book. But fundamentally, in the article, I end with this. This is big work that's deep and wide, lots to do in the world, whether we're thinking social justice or climate justice or working on economic and employment equity and justice, lots to do in the world. Find your square. We all don't have to do everything. The beauty of community and the beauty of doing the work we do in the world is that we can each find our square. We can connect to others doing that work, and we can amplify and spread and allow people to work through trauma and get to transformation, because we bring this trauma-informed lens to the work we do in AI. Bar none, when I work with groups that have centered appreciative inquiry in their practice, the question is, but when people are so hurt, when people are feeling so negative, when their narrative is so one way, how do I keep pulling them to AI? You pull them to AI by acknowledging the trauma context. You allow them to name what's so, because in that there is healing and there's resonance, and that leads to transformation. So find your square, operate from resonance, connect to your resonance community, co-design the way forward, collaborate, then differentiate, where we know very well we need to self-organize, which often means going out into self-organized groups, but then coming back and integrating with what's happening in community, and continue to learn and iterate. And these are the calls to action I left at the end of the article, so you'll see them there again. So I think that was the core, and we have a bit of time, just a little bit of time for questions. So Jessica and Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you to help with this piece. And that should lead us to the end.
Thank you, Yabom. Oh, let's just take a moment. Breathe in this amazing insight and gift that you've given us, and language and frameworks. Yes, let's open up and hear. Please use the chat as you wish again. And just as Yabom said, and as we've done, we'd love to hear some voices. So if you want to raise your hand, we're happy to help sort of bring your voice in, but also feel free to use the chat if there are particular curiosities, things that you would like to hear from Yabom. So Julie has a question in the chat, Yabom. I'll let you read it, but when clients, I'll speak it into the room for us too. When clients have you come in to work on an issue X, do you label the resonance conversation at the beginning, surfacing trauma, or do you just ask questions that allow trauma to surface?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the group. I think when I work with groups that have an awareness of trauma, I frame it up front. But for other groups, sometimes I have just gone into process, right? I've gone into the definition and discovery, but through that, I bring in the questions of the trauma context, and it's usually obvious. Again, language, as we know, matters in AI, and I can tell if if I'm hearing language that align with that big table of symptoms very quickly, then I pause and say, okay, what's the context here? I'm hearing this and this and this. What is the context that is surfacing this language? And then I hear all the trauma narrative. Then so we pause and we start with the dream wall, right? I stay there long enough to get clear on the question, to do that definition work. And then I use the disclosure of trauma to move into the deeper discovery, right? And then I'll just layer the questions as they come and put them into exercises with the questions that allow them to do deeper discovery, including surfacing resonance on the back end of that discovery before we do anything else.
Thank you.
And Miriam has a wonderful question too that I've heard come up in different circles, and I'm sure you have too, Yvonne. How can we make sure not to overlap our AI work when there is real need of therapy to heal trauma?
Yes, that's a great one. That's a really great question. And the only response I can give you is to go slow to go fast. So I have worked with groups and slowed down the process, spent a lot more time on resonance, on post the scream wall, right? Because part of this is the practice, it's the art and science, it's the mastery of knowing how long you can keep people in the trauma narrative without causing more harm, and knowing where your strength stops as a facilitator. Notwithstanding my work in human development, I am not a psychologist. So I do name, and for some groups, we will have counseling on hand. And for one group, we had critical incidents because of the context of trauma. We had critical incident stress debriefing available. So what we did was the discovery and the surfacing of the trauma context, the naming of that, had a big enough break for people to get time and space for processing, for canceling, for decompressing, but recognize that the surfacing of resonance also does a different thing than therapy does. So enough so that people are ready and able, people can breathe, they have the brain capacity to enter into the resonance conversation, and they'll tell you, right? It's also asking for that readiness. And then having the resonance conversation, but making sure that they continue to have, whether it's employee family assisted programs or critical incident stress debriefing available, or psychologists available on hand for the people that need it so that they can go to it. So it depends on context, but slowing down the process, right? We don't jump to, I won't jump quickly to dream work until I can tell people are ready, or they tell me they're ready.
Other questions? Yeah, Nina was inviting us to think of another, adding another D to our AA process, deep staying, having the clarity and courage to make therapy referrals at the right time, and that being in sort of deep, yes.
Yeah. I can tell you, I've often walked into contexts with a lot of anxiety. Like, what the heck? I'm not qualified to deal with the level of trauma that's here. Can I really do this work? I am surprised over and over again at the power of resonance work. Over and over again. Just 2 weeks ago, again, in a context where I was like, this is too far escalated. I don't know if this will be helpful. And I worry about causing more harm. But what I know is that this work is evidence-based and based on research, and people who have had extreme physical and psychological trauma sat with me and told me about the power of resonance from their experience, from their lives and their work in the world. So I go back to that and I stay with that. And inevitably surfacing the humanizing power. In the article, I talk about all the R words and how over the years, as I've done these sessions, people talk about, I needed this. This was about remembering. Because sometimes even, for the psychologists and therapy folks, I think you know this line as well, where sometimes people get stuck in they start ruminating the trauma instead of moving through it. And I think the power of appreciative inquiry, including the framing of resonant stories, is a different kind of framing to allow you to enter into that trauma differently. And it evokes something different.
Well, let me see if I see any more questions, voices to get in. And I know, Yubom, I know you have some closing thoughts for us, so I want to make sure that we give you space for that. I don't see anything else in the text chat.
And you know, I think I'm good with having shared that that summary slide already in terms of facilitating transformation after trauma, and just the practical find your squares and etc. So what I'd like to do is just open and have people put a waterfall in chat. And by the way, whoever wrote Scream Wall to Dream Wall, I love that. I've lost it in my scroll here. I had actually typed, love that. I'm taking that with me. Thank you for that. And so what I'd really like to do is open up for a bit of a waterfall, one word from you that describes how you're leaving this space, having come into it to sit with what's trauma got to do with it. How are you leaving this space? Just one word. Thank you. Lighter, connected, hopeful, resonant, kinder, inspired, encouraged, compassion, resonant, lighter, again, encouraged, hopeful, love it, keep them coming, grateful, purposeful, related, again, connected, that human connectedness happening here, still reflecting. Thank you, Amanda. Makes so much sense. Thank you. Keep them coming, connected, grateful, light. Yeah, connecting so many dots. I love all the ones I'm seeing about light. It's bringing lightness, both in terms of, in seeing those words for me, both in terms of the visual, but in terms of the presence we bring in sitting in and allowing people to reflect their humanity through resonant stories. I think brings a new light to the traumatic context that allows for that transformation. So thank you for that word. Thank you, Ken. Receiving courage from you. Thank you for being here. Hadn't seen you. Affirmed. Thank you for your work too, Nina. Thank you for these. I'm good, Jessica and Lindsay. I'm complete. If you are, I'm aware it's past the hour, so all yours.
Oh, thank you, Yvonne, for this true gift of your work and presence in the world, and for bringing this light and gift into our conversation today. It just the perfect moment, I think, in our jamming to have this conversation with you that is obviously going to resonate and ripple on beyond just today and this session. So can we just please take a collective, again, sort of breath together in appreciation for Yubom and the gift that she's brought us today. So with that, I just want to, again, invite us into a self-care moment as well. We know that there's a lot of things that people are holding and sitting with right now in different ways. And so we invite you to take the time and the space that you need to take a breath, to find a hand to hold or a space to reflect and continue on your own sort of reflection on your stories and the work that you have begun here in this space. We have a full hour until our next session that we'll be gathering together. So we hope that you will take that hour to do, and I say Yubom, yes, Yubom.
May I offer something? Usually in transitioning from resonance to possibilities, one of the ways that we anchor resonance stories is to find a symbol. So maybe that might be a helpful as you decompress and self-care, is to, what's a symbol of your resonance story? I'm not wearing it this morning. I have a necklace I often wear when I do resonance work. The pendant says, "What is your story?" And I carry that with me because a participant at a conference where I gave a keynote left my session, and it wasn't all about resonance, but I talked about resonance and the power of story. Left the session, went to, I think we were in Tacoma. Went shopping, went into an antique store, saw the pendant, bought it. We were on a sprawling campus, didn't know if they would see me again, but bought it because of my session and determined that if they saw me, they would give it to me. And happened to see me on the last day of the conference, ran across to find me and handed it to me as a gift. So I carry it with me. And it's a reminder for me, both of my own resonance story and of the power of doing this work in the world, knowing that I don't know where it goes. I don't know who it touches and how it touches folks. But my commitment, because of my story, is to do this work. So not wearing it today, but you can see me holding it symbolically, and an invitation to maybe find a symbol for yourself that you can carry with that returns you to resonance, especially when the going gets tough. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Yvonne. That's a wonderful invitation to us all. Again, whether it's over the next hour, the next day, the next month, to sort of find and explore what is that symbol that that we can carry with us metaphorically or physically. And so with that, yes, we'll close our session now. We have again an hour to do and breathe and be, and hopefully we will see many of you regathered in an hour for our community open space, which is really a wonderful opportunity. I know several of you are going to be leading conversations on a variety of different topics that have bubbled and emerged and curiosities. And so we'll gather together in just about an hour, and we will talk you through that process of how we will do our open space. But it's an opportunity to dive in a little deeper on a variety of different conversations that have been seeded. So with that, thank you again, Yvonne, and be well. And we will continue our collective story together here in just a few moments later. So
Thank you.